Welcome, very warm welcome to our book group this evening and tonight. Tonight we are looking at the interior castle, but the third dwelling place. Got quite a few to get through, but at least we got to number 3. And what I wanted to give you is an idea of what was going on in Spain at the time. What was the atmosphere that was in which Teresa of Avila was working, trying to do reforms? And I think I said I would do this last time we met, and so I thought I'd do it for you tonight because it's really interesting to think about. So what is the world in which she is moving and working, in which she is moving and in which she is working? Get rid of that. Because it's really important to get an idea of what's the context in which she is writing and doing what she is doing. Okay, hopefully I've got rid of that now. So we're going to have a little look, and I'm going to give you a really general idea of what was going on in Spain in the 16th century. And the same as whenever you do these generalizations, and these vast sweeps of history, naturally, it's rather a bit of a blunt tool, and you miss all the nuances and the intricacies, and also it's really easy for inaccuracies to come on. So I asked you to bear with me, but I just want to give you that sense. What was Spain like in which Teresa of Avila was living and moving and writing and founding her different communities? So there are four things I'm going to have a look at. And the first, which is, I'm sure you remember the rhyme, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So it was the great time of conquest of different parts of the world, particularly of the Americas. But of course, that conquest didn't start in 1492, as the little rhyme tells it. Actually started for Spain much earlier. It began with the Castilian conquest of the Canary Islands in around 1402, and it finished in 1495. So actually it was a lot later. It was in the actual 15th century, not the 16th century. So Teresa is living in a time when the conquest has happened a long time ago, actually, for her. And all that came out of the conquest is she is living in the fruits of that time. Because as we know, it meant an enormous amount of wealth that came particularly from the Americas over to Spain and made the king and made the nobility extremely wealthy. But the Americas wasn't just the part of the world that Spain conquered. They also conquered places as well as the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, and the Philippines, and also for a while they held the Netherlands as well. So at that time, they were the most enormous empires. They were the first of the great empires of world history, the first global empire. Their rival at the time was just Portugal, just at the end. So it's Spain and Portugal vying for these lands and all the wealth that they actually had. As I say, the conquest brought enormous riches to Spain, because they didn't just take all the gold and the silver and all the luxury goods, but what they opened up were trading routes. And the trading routes were the most important things in the way people made their money. Alongside this, of course, you had Christopher Columbus, who was doing this on behalf of the crown. So he was working for Ferdinand and Isabella, so that all the wealth, all the lands that he conquered, went to the crown. But then, as we know, there were also the Spanish conquistadors who came over on their own terms and took over the land. And it was they who really sort of scooped up vast tracts of land from the indigenous people. And I think it's always very sad and rather devastating to read the story of conquest. It's as an English person and the British Empire, it's always a very embarrassing and humiliating time to think of that ideology that goes around the world saying, right, I don't care about you, you're mine now. So it was happening all the time here. And of course, what happened for the poor Aztec and the Mayan and the Inca people was it not only took over their political rule, they were a conquered people, but also the Europeans brought measles and smallpox and just devastated the native population. And of course, what that naturally did was then it had a knock-on effect and it reduced any ability for economic trading. So not only in the 16th century did silver flow from Mexico, but also, as I say, Spain, and there this increase in luxury goods and also in grain. So the colonies were a really rich resource that caused loads of cash to inflow into the great empire that was Spain at the time. This is often called the Golden Age, the Golden Age of Spain, because this was a time when Spain dominated the seas and there was a great flourishing of the arts. Those who were in control at the time were the Habsburgs. So you have Charles I, who became the Holy Roman Empire. Then his son Philip, who followed him and became Philip II of Spain, along with his brother Ferdinand. And they were great patrons of the arts because what's the best way to show that you are really rich and powerful and, it's to show it through art and also through religious art. So Philip built that enormous kind of monastery place. I don't know if you've ever been to, which is the El Escorial, an incredible place to visit today. Well, he had that built. And then you have some of the famous painters who are working at the time. You have Velázquez, you have El Greco, and then the music that was particularly brought to the liturgy that really opened up that kind of way of singing counterpoint on lots of different parts and levels. So the real masters of that were Victoria and Lobo, and they really shaped the Renaissance music going into the later stages, times. And also you have the literature that's coming out of this time, Cervantes with the Don Quixote and the playwright Viga. So a real flourishing for Spain off the back of other people's wealth, really, and resources of the land. But this was the time of conquest and the golden era. But as we know, whenever there is this sort of flourishing and enormous wealth, there comes alongside it unrest. So there was a social unrest going on at the time because the money that was coming from the new worlds, as they were called, went primarily to the nobility. It didn't come to those who were the peasants at the time, and it was invariably used to fund wars. So the people who were really shouldering the financial burdens of the time were the peasants, whereas all the cash was being spent on wars. So in 1560, there were plans to consolidate control of the Netherlands, which then led to what was known as the 80 Years' War, and that consumed much of the Spanish expenditure during the 16th century. There was, of course, another extremely expensive failure, which I have to be careful, and that included the attempt to invade England and the Spanish Armada, which decimated the fleet in storm, but also, I didn't realize that it cost 10 million ducats. Now, 10 million today seems quite a lot of money, but 10 million then, you can see it must have just, yeah, a disaster for the Spanish, but of course, yay for the English. So there was also economic and admin problems in Castile with rising inflation, so rising costs. Along with the European wars, there was also the aftermath of the expulsion of all the Jews and the Moors from Spain. If any of you have been to that beautiful, beautiful city of Cordoba, you'll see, you know, the wonderful flowering of Moorish architecture, but also, you know, the synagogue, and absolutely glorious times when different cultures were enmeshed together in one city. And with the expulsion of the Jews, that literally sent packing all the people who were bringing in the trade, who were holding up cities like Cordoba. So this meant to an increasing dependency on the money that came from the colonies. And then a little bit like us, we've all lived through COVID, and we know the dreadful experience it is for a generation, not just to live with COVID and those who die, but then to live in the aftermath of COVID. I think all of us are sort of saying, where's the money? There's no money anymore. You know, where are the jobs? And so the aftermath of COVID, we can understand probably a bit better some of the ramifications that plague had on Europe, not only in the 14th century, but also later. So plague ravaged Spain in 1596 to 1602, so right at the end of the 16th century, killed 10% of the population. And of course, those people who were affected were the most were those who were the poorest, so it devastated the labour force. Now, of course, in England, when we had the late 14th century plague, it devastated the workforce too, and then you see a gradual change in demographic of the whole society with the rise of the mercantile and the middle classes. And that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's a kind of a trend. Whether that happened in Spain or not would be quite an interesting thing to just think about. So naturally, what began, though, with this golden age of Spain by 1602, by the beginning of the 17th century, the Habsburgs, which were the great bringers of this wealth, were really in decline. This was also a time of religious unrest, and you may have touched on that a little bit with Teresa, because this really speaks into her situation and into her experiences. So there was unrest, but there was also revival. The unrest is all focused around what has come to be known as the Counter-Reformation. And we can date this sort of period of the Counter-Reformation from the Council of Trent, which took place in 1545 and ended with the political conclusion of wars of the religion in 1648. So a long period of real unrest. And of course, this came out of all the Protestant sort of re-evaluation of faith and a real turning their back on the Roman Catholic and seeking much more a personal sort of engagement with Scripture and with God, and a real turning away from devotional and also the primacy of the Pope. The Counter-Reformation is often seen as a very decisive response to the Protestant movement at the time. And we see then actually it doesn't naturally grow out of something. It's very decisive decision. This is what we're going to be. This is what we're going to do in response. So rather than seeing something coming from the ground up, which I guess you could see move through in England, particularly from the 14th century, there's a sort of a move and unrest that then flowers later into the Protestant Reformation in the English time. This is a very decisive council decision. So you see that it's based upon doctrine, it's based upon letters, it's based upon documents, people being set up, new ways of doing things, revision of the old. So, for example, apologetic and polemic documents in defense of Roman Catholicism came out of this. There was anti-corruption efforts, so the setting up of the Inquisition. There are spiritual movements, and of course, Teresa of Avila is very much part of that spiritual movement. There's a promotion of the religious life and a flourishing of new religious art and musical styles. So in a sense, it's an enormous revival of the Roman Catholic faith, but of course it's done in opposition to the Protestant, and I think it's interesting to think about that. So some of the reforms included going back to how priests were trained, particularly in their spiritual life, and also in the theological traditions of the church. So it's getting your doctrine right so you can argue against the kind of Protestant understanding of the faith. But it's also about reforming, really cleaning up, cleaning the closet up and going back to have a much simpler understanding of what the religious life is like. And I guess this is where Teresa of Avila fits in beautifully, because it was her who was in the convent. Can't remember the first one she was in. It was probably in Avila, and who just saw that the parlor room had become just a place for the nobility to sit and have a nice chat with each other. And that was supposed to be the parlor of the convent, so that the convent and the social world of that city were actually, there was very little to differentiate them. And so she said, well, this is ridiculous. And we learn all about that in her life, of course, her autobiography. So she absolutely speaks into that and a desire to reform, to go back to simpler, more profound, I would say, spiritual foundations and following of the Christian life. And of course, we see in Teresa of Avila and also in John of the Cross a very different understanding of what we call now mysticism and a deep personal relationship with God. Well, look at this. I'll look at this another week and how does she understand mysticism? But it's very different from what we've been looking at in the other books, in the other, in the other texts that we've been reading. It's very distinct. And sometimes you can feel that she's kind of lost you on the page a bit, and that actually this is a bit her experience. But what she's trying to describe is something that she sees as being accessible and available for everyone. It's not just restricted to her. But how she understands that, how she understands the mystical life, how she understands the contemplative life, is really interesting. And it will be, and I think it's would be a helpful way of thinking about her mysticism within the context of the Counter-Reformation. Now, as we know, poor old Teresa, she didn't have an easy ride of this. It's not like everyone went, hey, Teresa, you're here, come and reform the church. No, she had a really, really difficult time. And in 1576, unreformed members of the Carmelite order began to persecute her. And it led to all further founding of reformed convents to be banned by the general chapter. So they literally, the Carmelite order at the time, literally completely squashed her zeal to actually return. So it wasn't a simple thing to do. She actually had to fight against what was going on at the time, the malaise, I guess we could say. So she was extracted then to go into voluntary retirement, and she chose the convent of St. Joseph's at Toledo to do that, and then it finished. But she knew, clever lady, she knew who was the most powerful people and at that time, and it wasn't necessarily the general chapter of the Carmelite order, it was actually the king. So she went to Philip II, and as a result, in 1579, had all the cases that were brought by the Inquisition upon her being dropped, and was allowed to resume all her new foundations. So I think that gives us a really interesting insight into, I guess we're all living in a certain age. We all live in a context, the context of our times. But I think it helps us to look at her text, The Interior Castle, and just think, so what is it? Why is she writing this? What are the motivations that are coming out of her age that are actually meaning that she wants to express her own spiritual life in this way? Why is she doing that? And also how very clever she was to use the power brokers of the time to actually further her cause. But also why? Why does she want to go back and get a simpler rule? Why does she want to simplify life? What is it about her time that she sees as decadent and corrupt? and what's she trying to return to. And I think we see that particularly in the first three dwelling places. You see this whole sort of grappling with basically the issues of ordinary world, or the temptations, or the things that we might like to do, all those kind of things she's grappling with. And if you place that within the atmosphere of the golden age of Spain, it gives us a really rich understanding of Teresa and her writing. So I'm going to now stop, and I will put you into some breakout rooms. We've got lots of people with us this evening, which is always good news. And those people who are leaving at this point, like to leave, then farewell. And we won't be meeting next week because I've got to give an online talk somewhere. And instead, we'll be meeting on the 14th, the 14th of October, which gives you lots of time to think about and read the 14th dwelling place. But don't worry, I'll put the questions to ponder up for you so that you can have some guided ideas to look for in your reading.